The wind drifted softly over the wide plains, bending the tall grasses that had nourished herds for countless generations. Beneath the fading light of late autumn, a small group of families moved slowly along the paths once traced by bison, their footprints marking the open stretch of a boundless land. The air carried a faint trace of frost, though the rivers still flowed unhindered. These people understood the language of the seasons, the long days spent gathering, the brief evenings, and the still hush that warned of coming cold. They had learned directly from the earth, reading each signal as if it spoke in a quiet dialect of endurance. All around them stretched a world of open sky and restless life, pronghorns scattered across the horizon, hawks circling above, and thin smoke rising from far-off camps. Every breath of wind reminded them that warmth would soon slip away. In past winters, they had built brush shelters and low windbreaks, yet each passing year brought harsher storms. Now their thoughts turned toward something sturdier, something able to withstand the chill and travel again when the herds moved. And somewhere far from that ancient plain, perhaps in New York where night settles beyond your window, or in Delhi where the first rays touch your screen, maybe in Buenos Aires where the story drifts through the city's hum, or in Seoul as sleep begins to find you, imagine the breath of those first winters and let this calm voice walk beside it. If this tale grants you a moment of peace, tell me where you are listening from. It helps me see the world gathered around this same fire. The families who followed the mighty herds knew that motion itself guarded them from hunger. Each season they carried their lives across the plains, bundles of hides, stone tools, bone needles, and the memory of fertile ground. As daylight shortened, they searched for places where the wind eased and wood could still be gathered. Women stretched new hides from recent hunts, scraping and softening them with ash and marrow until they became light yet strong. Men walked along the riversides, choosing tall, straight poles of pine or willow, testing each for balance and strength. Children followed close behind, picking up smaller sticks, sinew cords, and dry grass. The air around them smelled of cold water and distant snow. Every movement held meaning, every hide prepared and every pole chosen with care. There were no drawn plans, no written directions, yet every hand seemed to know the next step. Around the evening fires, sparks drifted upward like small stars as families spoke quietly of the frost to come. What they built in the days ahead would decide not only their comfort, but their survival once winter locked the plains in silence. As frost began to settle along the edges of the river, the smoke from campfires turned a faint shade of blue against the tightening cold. Each night families huddled beneath layers of hides, their breaths rising in thin clouds inside their half-finished shelters. They listened to the soft crackle of burning wood and to the faraway calls of geese heading south, a reminder that even the sky itself was moving. The elders spoke of the earliest winters, of seasons when the storms arrived too soon, and the grass huts could not withstand their fury. They remembered nights when the wind howled so fiercely that fires died before dawn, and mornings when the earth split with frost. From those memories came wisdom. A home must bend with the wind, not stand stubbornly against it. Smoke must find its way out, or warmth will vanish within. Around the fire, the young ones watched closely as the elders arranged poles on the ground, shaping triangles first, then circles, and finally a rising cone. They studied the way each line met the other, balanced yet strong. The form of the tipi was not born of chance, but of patient observation, of wind, of weight, of the wide sky above. What they built would not fight the land. It would exist in harmony with it. Morning broke pale and cold, a stillness so sharp that sound traveled far across the open plains. The families rose early, shaking frost from the hides covering their bundles. Down by the river, the men stripped bark from poles and smoothed their tips with stone blades. Women spread large hides across nearby bushes, brushing them clean and marking seams where stitches would soon run. Steam rose from both breath and water, blending into the quiet air. All through the camp came the rhythmic sound of work, steady, deliberate, patient. Children carried handfuls of dry grass and thin roots to weave into bindings, their laughter short and bright in the cold. Every motion had meaning, each task leading to the next, small efforts combining to form something that had not yet stood. The elders walked among them, testing the balance of each pole, shifting angles in the dirt with bare hands. What they were shaping was more than a place to sleep. It was a way of living within a changing world. The teepee would rise not as a barrier to nature, but as part of it, breathing with the same pulse as the wind and the plains around them. By week's end, daylight faded sooner, and the first snowflakes drifted gently into the valley. The camp had gathered enough hides to raise their first complete teepee before the deep cold arrived. The poles leaned together like the ribs of a great creature, bound at the top with braided sinew, forming a frame that reached toward the dimming sun. The hides, softened and stitched with precision, were lifted and wrapped around the frame, one layer over another until only the doorway faced the light. When the final seam was tightened and tied, an immense calm filled the air. Smoke from the first fire inside curled upward through the top opening, carrying the smell of pine and ash. Children crawled in first, their eyes wide with warmth and wonder. Outside, the plains stretched silent and white, but within, the orange glow of firelight danced across the hide walls. The people sat close, sharing their first meal cooked in this new home. Beyond the circle of light, night spread across the plains. Inside, they rested for the first time that season, sheltered within a form that would serve them for generations. The teepee now stood ready for winter's long breath. The change arrived softly. Mornings grew sharper, and the air carried a weight that clung to breath and bone. Across the plains, puddles by the river's edge hardened into glass, and the grass that once whispered underfoot now cracked beneath each step. The families watched the herds move faster toward the south, their shapes fading into the sinking light. Every sign confirmed what they already understood. Winter was drawing near. At dawn, the men rose before the sun to check the poles stored by the willows, testing the knots that held them tight. The women worked the hides, rubbing them with tallow so they would resist the damp. Children collected brush and dried dung for the fires, their small footprints circling the camp like pathways of purpose. When the wind turned north, it carried with it the faint scent of snow. The sky paled, and the daylight seemed to shorten by the hour. They spoke less now, saving their voices for work. The earth that once welcomed bare feet had hardened, cold and unyielding. By the river bend, they knew it was time to assemble the shelters that would guard them through the long silence ahead, their winter teepees. They began with what the season offered. Long poles, cured by weeks of sun and smoke, were carried in bundles to the chosen site. Each pole was measured by hand, weighed for balance, then placed in a growing pile beside the fire. The women prepared the hides that would wrap around them, sewing edges with bone needles and strips of sinew soaked until soft. Every task was carried out with quiet precision, guided by memory rather than instruction. The hides were smoothed with stone polishers until they glimmered faintly in the pale light. Some were painted with simple symbols, lines that told of families or hunts, but even this was done in stillness. All around, the plains had fallen silent. Insects had vanished. The sky stretched gray and empty. Thin smoke rose from cooking fires in straight lines, the cold air too heavy to twist them. By midday, the camp moved in a rhythm of preparation, hammering poles, cutting cords, softening hides. Every motion led toward one goal, readiness. No one spoke of fear, though they all felt its shape in the cold air. It was the same presence that visited each year, and each time they built against it. The choice of where to raise their tipis mattered as much as the building itself. Out on the open plains, the wind could be both ally and enemy. Too much exposure and the hides would tear. Too low and cold mist would gather at the base. The elders walked the land slowly, pressing the soil beneath their feet and tracing the curve of the nearby hills. They searched for a slope facing east, where the sun's first light could touch the doorway and melt the frost at morning. By the river, clusters of willow offered shelter and fuel. When the place was chosen, the families worked together to clear the ground, flattening snow, removing stones, and marking spots for each fire pit. Their movements were efficient and practiced, shaped by years of endurance. Even in silence, they moved as one. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, freezing the river's edges into glassy sheets. The first poles were laid upon the ground, their shadows long under the moonlight. Tomorrow, the frames would rise. Tonight they lay close by the fire, listening to the wind sighing through the grass, already picturing the warmth their new tipis would soon hold. The next morning opened beneath a pale, colorless sky. Frost had hardened the soil, and thin sheets of ice traced the puddles where horses once drank. Each step across the ground made a brittle crunch. The families rose wordlessly, each knowing what the day required. The men lifted the first poles upright, forming a tripod that would guide the rest. The sound of creaking wood and the pull of sinew cords broke the silence of the cold air. Nearby, the women unfolded the cured hides, spreading them neatly beside the fires to soften under the warmth. Children darted between the workers, collecting stakes, tools, and bunches of dry grass for bedding. Apart from their movements, the land was utterly still. The camp pulsed with a calm rhythm of labor, steady, unbroken, and purposeful. They worked until their breaths came in mist, and their fingers stiffened from the cold, stopping only to sip warm broth from skin bags. By late afternoon, the first frame stood tall, its poles angled cleanly against the gray sky. The family stepped back to look at it, not as a finished shelter, but as a beginning, a mark of endurance. Around them, the wind brushed softly through the dry grass, carrying a faint sound like whispered approval. By dusk, the camp had transformed. Smoke from several fires drifted low across the plains, and the smell of drying hides mingled with the scent of pine resin and ash. Women continued sewing by firelight, their hands sure and steady, while men checked each pole's binding for strength. Sparks leapt upward, brief and bright, vanishing into the freezing night. Inside one nearly completed tipi, a small flame burned in a shallow pit, testing how the smoke escaped through the top vent. The hide walls quivered gently, alive in the breeze. The elders observed closely, nodding when the draft carried cleanly through. They knew that such small details meant survival. Outside, families wrapped up their tools and tied them in leather, setting them by the entrances for morning use. The cold deepened fast, carrying the first edge of the snow yet to fall. From within the new shelters came faint sounds, soft voices, shifting movements, the scrape of wooden bowls. The first night of their new season had arrived. Though the work remained unfinished, the camp stood ready to face the storm. Beneath the dim glow of scattered fires, the people of the plains rested under their hides, waiting quietly for winter's hand. The season of storms crept closer, and the people began moving once again. Across the vast plains, their footprints followed the same faint trails that their ancestors had walked for generations. They searched for a place that could sustain them through the deep cold, somewhere near water, with enough wood for fuel and shelter from the harshest winds. The bison had already drifted south, leaving the land wide and still. Along the river valleys, patches of willow and cottonwood offered both protection and material for their work. The elders led the way on foot, scanning the horizon for the slightest sign of movement or danger. Their eyes trained by countless winters of travel. The young carried poles balanced across their shoulders, while others guided dogs hauling small bundles tied to frames of hide and wood. Frost sparkled on the grass as the pale sun broke through low clouds. They stopped often, listening to the wind, testing its direction with handfuls of dust. Every decision depended on how the earth felt beneath their feet. Step by step, they drew closer to the ground that would cradle their tipis and provide safety against the long white silence ahead. By midday, they reached a wide stretch of land bordered by a slow-moving river and a ridge of low hills. Here the air felt calm, and the ground sloped gently toward the east. The elders exchanged quiet nods, reading the landscape with practiced certainty. The soil was dry enough to hold stakes and high enough to escape the floods that sometimes followed sudden thaws. Around them, faint traces of old campfires revealed that others had once stayed here, perhaps the winter before, or the one before that. The people moved quickly but deliberately, marking out where each teepee would stand, leaving space for walkways and fire pits. The river offered both water and protection from the north wind. Men collected fallen branches for burning, while women unpacked the hides, spreading them to warm beneath the thin sunlight. The air filled with the steady scraping of tools and low murmurs of conversation. A few hunters moved farther out, studying tracks along the frozen banks. Here, they decided, they would stay until spring's first thaw. The land provided what they needed: water, wood, and peace. As the light faded, the camp began to take form, quiet and deliberate as the changing dusk. When night came, the camp settled into its rhythm. Fires glowed along the river's edge, small islands of warmth across the cold, open ground. The people ate simple meals, strips of dried meat softened over the flames and roots gathered earlier in the season. Their movements slowed, not from weariness, but from calm purpose. The elders spoke softly, reminding the younger ones to bind the poles tightly, to face the teepee's doorway toward the dawn so the first light could melt away the frost. Sparks rose and disappeared into the dark sky, carried away by a wind that never completely slept. Far in the distance, wolves called to one another, their cries echoing across the plains. Yet within the circle of fires, safety prevailed. The steady voice of the river and the warmth of the flames merged into a single rhythm, marking the beginning of their winter stay. Tomorrow, the building would begin, the poles lifted, the hides pulled tight, and their homes sealed against the cold. For now, the people rested close to the earth that had welcomed them once again. Beneath the clear night sky, they slept peacefully, knowing they had found the ground that would hold their lives until the season changed. The next morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight glinting on the frozen grass. From the edge of camp, the plains stretched endlessly, rolling and pale beneath a thin layer of frost. The men rose early to mark the final spots where the teepees would stand, measuring the space between each one by laying a pole flat along the ground. Beside them, the women carried stones from the riverbank to line the fire pits and to weigh down the hides once raised. The younger ones gathered armfuls of dry reeds for bedding and insulation, their laughter short and bright in the still air. Every hand moved with the same steady rhythm, every action carried purpose. The people worked not as separate families, but as one body guided by the land itself. When the sun reached its highest point, they stopped briefly to eat, sitting together in small clusters near low fires. Steam rose from their food and drifted away into the bright, thin air. In that moment of stillness, surrounded by the soft sounds of scraping tools and breaking twigs, they could already picture a full circle of teepees standing firm against the coming wind. a world of their own shaped by patience, memory, and need. By late afternoon, the first frames were taking form along the curve of the river. The tall poles leaned together, tied with sinew at their peaks, their bases pressed firmly into the frozen earth. Around each growing structure, movement filled the air. The whisper of hides being lifted, cords being tightened, hands working without pause, the rustle of leather mixing with the distant cries of geese. One by one, the tipis began to rise, each doorway facing east toward the light. As the sun sank low, its red glow washed over the hides, turning them gold against the snow. Smoke from small fires began to wind upward through the cooling air, fading softly into the sky. The camp had taken shape now, a ring of shelters glowing faintly, a warm heart in the vast emptiness of the plains. Inside the first finished teepee, a small fire burned low, testing the strength of its new frame. The hide walls swelled gently with the passing wind, alive and steady. Outside, the families gathered in silence to watch, understanding what it meant. Their journey for this season had ended. The plains stretched quiet once more, broken only by the faint crackle of firewood and the whispering wind brushing the edges of the hides. Each teepee that rose upon the plains carried within it generations of understanding. This knowledge did not come from drawings or written plans, but from memory, passed through hands, preserved in practice. Elders had learned the alignment of poles by watching those who came before them, counting each motion until it became as instinctive as breathing. The frame began with 3 strong poles tied together, lifted into a tripod that leaned into the direction of the wind. From there, each new pole was added carefully, one after another, spiraling around the central space. Every angle had meaning. Too wide, and smoke would linger inside. Too narrow, and the fire would suffocate. The women, skilled in working the hides, knew exactly how each piece should overlap, guiding rain downward and warmth inward. They spoke softly as they worked, testing seams, straightening folds, and aligning the entrance toward the east where morning light first touched the land. The teepee's design had no waste, no decoration made only for beauty. Every line existed for a reason, each part serving the purpose of survival. When the final rope was tightened and secured, the elders nodded with quiet satisfaction. The form standing before them was more than shelter. It was the very pattern of endurance. The making of a teepee was a shared task divided by experience and skill. The men shaped the poles, smoothing and evening them until the pale wood shone beneath the cold light. The women softened the hides through long hours of scraping, rubbing, and folding until they became warm and pliant to the touch. When the hides were ready, they were sewn together in long, curved panels that wrapped around the frame like skin over bone. Children fetched tools, carried water from the nearby stream, and watched carefully, learning more from observation than words. Small fires burned around the work area, warming hands and drying sinew cords. Everyone had a role. Though no one spoke of rank, the oldest among them guided each decision. They knew which winds struck hardest, how to position the smoke flaps, and where the doorway must face. Through repetition, their knowledge lived on, transferred not through writing but through motion and memory. When the final covering was lifted and fastened, the air filled with the dry sound of leather brushing wood. The first true walls of winter stood breathing in the open plain, ready to face the cold. Each teepee had its own rhythm of construction, yet all moved in harmony with the land. The poles rose like the bones of the earth, light, flexible, and enduring. Around them, the families worked in calm coordination, testing, adjusting, and tying without hesitation or waste. The hides were wrapped in a slow spiral, each seam overlapping the next like layered feathers on a bird's wing. At the top, Two movable flaps served as smoke vents, their motion guided by long poles inside the structure. This design let the fire breathe freely without inviting the cold. It had not been invented in haste, but shaped by centuries of experience, refined through countless winters. A tipi could be built in a single day and dismantled within an hour, yet it stood firm against both wind and snow. Its perfection rested in its simplicity. As they worked, the camp filled with the sounds of scraping tools, tightened cords, and quiet voices. The rhythm of creation flowed without pause, as smooth and steady as the changing of seasons. When the final poles were secured, the form that emerged seemed no different from the hills or the rivers that surrounded it, another part of the living plains. Once the frame stood complete, their focus turned inward, to the life that would fill the space. The inside of each tipi was arranged with deliberate care, refined through years of experience in balancing warmth, light, and storage. At the center lay the fire pit, a shallow ring of stones that cradled glowing embers through the long nights. Behind it, sleeping areas were laid out on layers of dried grass and hides for insulation. Tools and weapons rested near the doorway where the cold air entered least. Along the inner walls, leather bags hung from cords, holding sinew, dried meat, herbs, and other small necessities. Every detail followed a logic born of generations of testing and memory. The people knew that an uneven vent or misplaced fire could mean danger during the night. Above, the smoke flaps were tied open to reveal the stars, allowing a thin ribbon of warmth to escape. Inside, the air carried the mingled scent of pine, ash, and hide. When a family entered their newly built tipi for the first time, they stepped softly, as though entering something sacred. It was more than a dwelling. It was a living body that breathed, warmed, and sheltered them. It mirrored the shape of the land itself, translated into safety and endurance. Outside, the camp had transformed. Where the plains once lay bare and cold, now a circle of tipis shimmered under the pale winter sun, their hide walls glowing faintly in the light. The people moved quietly among them, adding finishing touches, placing stones around the base, covering doorways, and painting the sides with symbols that marked family history or honored past hunts. Each tipi carried its own story, told through pigments or fine cuts in the hide. From above, the arrangement formed a loose ring around central fires, the living heart of the camp. Smoke drifted upward in steady ribbons, dissolving into the open air. For the first time in many days, laughter returned, soft but certain. The work was done. The knowledge that shaped every line of these homes lived again, not written or spoken, but remembered through practice. As the sun lowered, shadows stretched across the plains, touching each tipi in turn. Inside, the fires burned through the night while the people rested beneath the same stars that had guided their ancestors. The pattern continued, unbroken. By noon, the first heavy winds of winter swept across the plains, a long and steady sound that rolled through the valleys like distant waves. The people moved quickly to strengthen their new shelters. The tipis stood firm, but the open land offered no mercy. Each gust tested the work of their hands. The men tightened the bindings around the poles, driving stakes deeper into the frozen earth with heavy stones. The women pressed the lower edges of the hides flat, packing them with earth and snow to seal the gaps where drafts slipped through. The cold bit at their faces, numbing fingers and ears, yet no one stopped for long. They moved with quiet urgency, their motions steady and efficient. Smoke flaps were turned away from the wind, and door coverings were tied down tightly against the chill. When the gusts grew fiercer, the people crouched beside the poles, listening to the hum and strain of the structure as it bent but did not break. Every sound told them something, where to tighten, where to adjust. The tipis swayed gently with the wind, built to yield rather than resist. By dusk, the storm began to pass. The hides held firm, the fires still burned, and the people had learned once again that true strength lies in balance. Inside, the light of the flames flickered against the curved walls, echoing the rhythm of the wind outside. Families gathered close, repairing small seams and reshaping the hearthstones to control the flow of air. Children sat quietly near the fire, feeding thin twigs into the glowing coals and watching the smoke twist upward through the vent. Women tended the hides stretched across wooden frames, rubbing them with warm grease and scraping away any ice that had formed. Each small task carried purpose. The men checked the smoke poles, ensuring they still moved freely. They coated the bindings with tallow to keep them from cracking in the dry cold. Inside the teepee, the air stayed warm enough to rest, but cool enough to keep the hides supple. Outside, snow hissed softly against the hide walls, each grain whispering of the storm beyond. In the steady exchange between wind, fire, and work, life continued. Words were few, replaced by the sounds of tools and breathing. Survival was not loud or desperate. It was deliberate, quiet, and precise. It lived in the steady hands of those who refused to stop moving. When morning arrived, the plains lay white and unmoving. The storm had left a thin layer of snow that shimmered in the pale light. The teepees stood like small islands of warmth, their smoke rising straight and thin into the cold sky. Wrapped in hides, the people stepped out, brushing frost from their hair and shoulders. The wind had quieted, but its power still lingered in their minds. They walked around the edges of the camp, testing each binding, tapping the poles to listen to their sound. A dull tone meant ice had crept inside. A sharp one meant the wood was still strong. Women swept the entrances clear using brooms made from bundled grass, pushing the snow away from the fire pits. Men gathered fallen branches from the nearby ridge, their dark footprints marking winding paths through the white. Children carried small baskets filled with snow to melt for water, their laughter faint but bright in the frozen air. By midday, the sun's reflection on the snow burned with enough warmth to soften the hides. The camp felt renewed, steady, secure, and alive again. Everyone knew that more storms would come, yet their first great test was behind them. Their teepees had endured, a living testament to the wisdom passed down from their ancestors. The design they had inherited still belonged to those who lived. In the days that followed, the winds returned again and again, each storm carrying its own nature. Some brought snow that drifted high against the teepee walls. Others came dry and sharp, cutting through any opening it could find. The people had learned to read each change precisely. When the air grew brittle and dry, they dampened the hides before nightfall so they would tighten against the poles. When snow piled too deeply, they used wooden paddles to press it around the base, forming an insulated wall that held warmth inside. Their tipis were living things in their care, never still, always adjusted to the will of the plains. Inside, the sound of the wind became familiar, like a slow and steady breath rising and falling through the night. The hides shivered with every gust, but held firm, bending just enough to release the pressure. It was that small measure of flexibility, not defiance, that kept them safe. They understood that survival on these plains meant partnership, not resistance. Each repair, each adjustment, was a quiet conversation between people and the earth, spoken in hide, pole, and flame. When the last of the heavy winds faded, stillness returned. The sky cleared wide and blue, and for the first time in many days, the air carried a trace of warmth instead of frost. From the ridge above the valley, the circle of tipis looked small but complete, each one leaning slightly east, each smoke vent aligned in gentle symmetry. The people moved more slowly now, their tasks lighter. They repaired tools, dried meat, and tended the fires with calm precision. The clatter of poles had faded, replaced by the steady crackle of burning wood. As evening came, they gathered outside to share food, their voices low and easy in the calm air. Children drew patterns in the snow, while elders watched the fading light slip behind the hills. From a distance, the camp appeared as a cluster of faint orange glows against the blue dusk, a constellation of warmth across the frozen plain. It was the same pattern that had existed for centuries, a circle of life renewed each winter through patience and labor. As families returned to their tipis, the hides rustled softly in the night breeze. Above them, the stars hung motionless, ancient witnesses to the quiet work of human hands. When the first deep cold of winter finally settled across the plains, fire became the heart of every tipi. It was the single source of warmth, light, and life within a world wrapped in frost. Each morning began with the faint crackle of kindling, coaxed to flame by practiced hands. The men gathered dry willow branches and buffalo dung from places where the snow had not yet reached, while the women arranged the hearthstones to hold the heat steady through the long hours. The flames stayed small, but their strength lay in balance, hot enough to warm the air, never so high that smoke filled the shelter. Through the opening above, a thin thread of smoke rose skyward, shifting color with the day's light. Inside, the hides glowed softly in hues of amber and gold, and the air thickened with the scent of pine and earth. Families sat close around the fire, speaking in low voices, mending tools, sewing seams, or sharpening blades. The rhythm of the fire shaped their days, marking time between the gray light of dawn and the blue quiet of night. Outside, snow drifted endlessly across the open land, but within the circle of the tipi, the world remained still, held together by warmth and the steady patience of flame. Keeping the fire alive through the long nights was a duty shared by all. Before sleep, one person always remained awake to tend the coals, feeding them with dry wood until the first faint light appeared through the vent above. The coals were never allowed to die, for even a dull red glow meant safety. When the wind shifted and the smoke drifted low, they adjusted the flaps using long poles, guided by instinct learned from years of watching the air. Children observed carefully, memorizing which winds required a wider vent and which demanded closure. The tipi breathed like a living thing, the vent at its peak opening and closing like lungs, releasing the smoke that might otherwise suffocate the life it sustained. In the still hours before dawn, the red glow pulsed softly against the hides, casting moving shadows that swayed with the flame. Outside, snow whispered against the outer walls, piling slowly along the base. Inside, the fire murmured, its warmth pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark. The people slept lightly, waking at the faintest shift in draft or sound. To them, survival was more than shelter. It was a delicate balance between warmth, air, and light, maintained through constant care. During the days of deep cold, thin trails of smoke distinguished the living from the silent. Across the white plains, gray ribbons rose from the camps like quiet signals of endurance. The fires inside each tipi did more than give heat. They cooked meals, dried clothing, and strengthened tools. Women hung strips of meat on wooden racks above the flames, letting the smoke cure them for the days ahead. Men held spear shafts over the coals, turning them slowly to harden the wood. No spark was wasted. Every flicker served a purpose. Around each fire, a rhythm of life unfolded. They mended, carved, wove, and worked in silence, the crackle of wood and scraping of bone blending into a steady pulse. Each tipi had its own firekeeper, often the eldest or most skilled, who could judge the flame's health at a glance. The air inside stayed warm and dry, tinged with the faint sharpness of burned pine. Even when no one spoke, movement continued. The shift of a hand, the sigh of breath, the whisper of a tool against stone. Outside, the world lay white and still, yet inside, the glow of fire kept time, turning the hours as surely as the sun once did. As the winter deepened, the mastery of fire became both craft and ritual. They knew which wood burned long and clean, which sparked too much, and which produced smoke soft enough to preserve meat. Dried willow was valued for its even heat, pine for the fast flame that began each morning's light. Every ember was guarded with care, carried from tipi to tipi in bowls of ash, so none would be lost. When travelers arrived from neighboring bands, they brought glowing coals wrapped in hide, a gift of warmth shared among families. Fire spoke a language older than words, a connection that united those who endured the same cold. Inside each shelter, the balance between air and flame demanded attention. Too much heat, and the hides grew brittle. Too little, and frost crept along the walls. Women learned to tilt the coverings or open small vents with bone pins to guide the draft. The teepee breathed with them, alive, responsive, dependent on care. Children watched, wide-eyed, faces glowing orange in the light, memorizing how smoke drifted and how flaps moved with the wind. These lessons would last far beyond the season, shaping habits for the rest of their lives. When the longest night of the year came, the fires burned low and steady, their warmth reaching every corner of the shelter. Outside, snow fell in a soft whisper, brushing lightly against the hides. Inside, the family sat together in calm silence, their faces half lit by flame. The elders spoke quietly, reminding the young that the fire was not just heat, but memory, a living thread that had survived countless winters, connecting them to those who came before. The teepee walls trembled softly with the wind, breathing in rhythm with the light. The smell of smoke clung to hair and clothing, marking them as part of the land itself. Before resting, the firekeeper stirred the embers into a glowing ring that would last until morning. The final sound before sleep was the quiet crackle of wood, steady and alive. Outside, the plains lay dark and endless, but within each teepee glowed a small world of warmth. It was in those nights that they understood what endurance truly meant. Not resistance to the cold, but harmony with it. The fire would fade, but its spirit remained inside them, guiding every winter yet to come. Deep winter came without warning, a slow tightening of the air, a silence that swallowed even the wind. The snow stopped melting between storms, layering itself until the plains were sealed in white. The teepees stood half-buried, smoke curling faintly upward like thin gray threads against the pale sky. Inside, life shifted into a quieter rhythm. Fires burned low during the day to save fuel, then brightened at dusk when cold crept close to the ground. The families measured time not by the sun, but by the glow of the fire. Every movement was careful, every word soft. They rationed food from hanging bags of dried meat and roots. Children carved figures from wood and bone, their laughter brief but comforting. Outside, the snow pressed tight against the hides, muffling every sound. Even the animals had vanished, retreating into their own burrows of warmth. The world seemed smaller now, reduced to the circle of firelight and breath. Each day lived was a quiet victory against the frozen silence. When the storms grew stronger, patience became their greatest strength. For days, no one could hunt. The drifts were too deep, the herds too far. The men stayed inside, sharpening tools and carving new points for spears. The women repaired the hides where frost had stiffened them, their fingers working steadily despite the cold. Children gathered small sticks from beneath the snow, their hands red and raw. Inside, the walls seemed to breathe with life, expanding with heat, tightening when wind roared outside. They had learned to listen. A change in sound meant snow piling too high, or the wind turning its path. When the storms paused, they stepped out to clear the drifts, their bodies half buried in white, their movements quick and efficient. They spoke little. Their breath froze before the words could reach the air. The tipis stood like lone islands in a sea of snow, their smoke the only proof of life on the empty plains. Inside those thin walls of hide, they waited with calm resolve, trusting both their hands and the traditions that had carried them through countless winters. The warmth became its own world. Days blurred together, marked only by the rhythm of repeated tasks, cooking, mending, resting. The children listened to the elders' voices as they told the ancient stories, of the first shelters, of the bison's return each spring, of how patience was stronger than hunger. These stories were not for comfort, but for remembrance. They carried the map of survival, linking the living to all who came before. Outside, the winds moaned and the plains lay buried, but inside, the people found stillness. They spoke of the hunts to come, planned their journeys once the thaw began, and repaired what the cold had worn down. Through the smoke vent, stars appeared, sharp, distant, unchanging. The same stars their ancestors had seen through other winters in other valleys. In that light they found reassurance. This season too would pass. When the storms eased, even for a brief day, the camp awakened with renewed life. The men stepped outside first, shielding their eyes against the blinding brightness that followed the snowfall. The air was razor sharp, and every sound seemed to echo. The creak of poles, the crunch of frozen ground, the distant crack of ice shifting on the river. Hunters climbed the nearby ridges, scanning the horizon for tracks where the bison once roamed. They moved slowly, wrapped in layers of hides, their spears light but ready. Below, women melted snow for water, steam rising from their bowls into the clear air. Damp clothes were spread by the fires, the heat drawing out the frost. Children ran where the wind had swept the snow aside, gathering twigs and dry grass for fuel, their laughter breaking through the silence. For a few precious hours, the camp felt alive again, the sound of voices replacing the stillness that had ruled for so long. When clouds began to gather once more, the people returned to their tipis. The short burst of light had given them strength. They had learned that even in the hardest winters, the world offered pauses, moments to breathe, to repair, and to remember that endurance was built one day at a time. By late winter, the camp grew quiet again, though not weary. The people had found a deep calm born of routine. Food supplies were low but sufficient, the fires smaller yet steady. The hides had darkened from smoke, hardened at the edges with frost, but they held firm. Each family understood the meaning of what they had gained through those long months, the certainty that their ways worked, that patience and unity meant survival. At night, they spoke softly, counting how many times the wind had shifted, how many stars they had seen through the smoke vent. Beyond the hides, the plains remained locked in white, yet a faint scent of thaw began to rise from the ground. The elders felt it before anyone else, the promise of running water and the first birds of spring. Soon they would take down the tipis, pack the poles, and follow the herds once more. For now they rested beside their fires, wrapped in the warmth they had built and the quiet strength they had learned. The cold was no longer an enemy. It had become a teacher, shaping them as faithfully as the land itself. When the first hints of warmth touched the plains, the change came quietly. Snow softened along the edges, and streams began to whisper through the frozen ground. The sound of dripping water filled the air like a distant song. Inside the camp, families stirred from their winter rhythm. The fires no longer demanded constant tending, and the hides that had stiffened through the frost grew soft again under the gentler air. The shift brought reflection. Around the fires, they spoke of the season behind them, of storms endured, of shelters that had held fast. Each fire circle became a place of memory. They discussed which tipis had withstood the wind perfectly and which had needed mending. The elders walked among them, noting which poles had bent, which lashings had cracked. No mistake went unstudied. Each flaw became a lesson stored in memory for the next cold season. Knowledge was never written. It lived in stories, in gestures, in the ways hands moved across hide or tied a cord. The land itself was their teacher, and they had listened well. The cold had tested them, but it had also deepened their understanding. As the snow vanished, they began preparing to rebuild, not out of necessity, but from the desire to improve. When winter ended, the first task was to care for the tipis that had sheltered them. The hides were lifted from the frames and spread flat across the ground, brushed clean of soot and frost. Women inspected every seam, cutting away weakened threads and replacing them with new sinew, soaked until strong. Men arranged the poles in long rows, scraping off the roughness left by ice, sealing cracks with warm resin. Every piece was touched, checked, and repaired. This work was never rushed. It was an act of gratitude, a ritual of respect for what had endured with them. Children helped by peeling fresh willow bark to make bindings, learning through repetition and patience. The camp filled with the soft sounds of scraping, brushing, and quiet talk. The air smelled of thawed soil and lingering smoke, a scent that carried the promise of movement once more. When the hides dried under the pale sun, they became supple and light, ready for travel. The people knew the herds would soon return, and they would follow. But before they moved on, they made sure nothing from winter's hardship was forgotten. Survival depended not on luck, but on memory. The precise art of noticing where the cold had spoken and how they had answered. The lessons of winter belonged to everyone, not a single family alone. As the days lengthened and the air grew warmer, bands from neighboring camps gathered along the river valleys to share what they had learned. Elders clasped hands and nodded in greeting, their faces marked by wind and smoke. Around the fires, they exchanged knowledge. How one group had buried poles deeper to resist the wind, how another had sealed seams with fat to keep out drafts. Each detail passed like a gift, carried by word and memory from one camp to another. Younger ones listened in silence, absorbing every story. Between conversations, they traded dried meat and hides, repaired tools together, and helped one another lift tipis once more. The same land that had divided them during the storms now reunited them in calm. As the rivers widened with meltwater, they prepared to move, but they lingered for the comfort of shared wisdom. Knowledge was nourishment, too, passed not through possessions, but through trust. When the gatherings ended, the camp felt lighter. The tipis stood open to the wind, their hides raised to dry in the sun. The earth beneath them, once frozen, had softened again. The people moved slowly, savoring the ease that followed hardship. In the evenings, they sat outside instead of within their shelters, letting the cool air touch their faces. The elders spoke of cycles, of how every season tested and taught in equal measure. They reminded the youth that real strength was not found in resisting the cold, but in adapting to it. Across the plains, the bison herds began to wander north again, their trails faint but familiar in the damp soil. The people watched quietly, knowing soon they would follow. They were not bound by the season. They were shaped by it. Each winter left behind its lessons, and each spring carried them forward. When they looked upon their repaired tipis, they saw more than shelter. They saw wisdom stitched into every seam, proof of what patience could create. The land had taught them once more, and they answered with readiness, care, and the will to begin again. As the sun climbed higher and the last traces of frost disappeared, the camp began preparing for departure. The poles were gathered, the hides folded neatly, and the fire pits covered with earth. Nothing was left behind that could not return to the land. Each person worked quietly, their movements steady and familiar after a lifetime of migration. When the final tipi was taken down, Only the flattened grass marked where they had stayed. Before leaving, the elders paused, gazing back at the empty circle. The space that had once held warmth, laughter, and life through the hardest months. They knew that survival meant more than enduring the cold. It meant learning from it. The winter had shown them where to strengthen, where to yield, and when to trust the old wisdom that had never failed them. The children listened as their elders spoke their final words before the journey north. Soon, the plains would bloom again, the rivers swell, and the wind soften. But within every heart remained the echo of the storms they had faced, the lessons that would guide them when the snow returned. The tipis would rise once more, built stronger, wiser, and more faithful to the land that shaped them. The teachings of winter were complete. In the years that followed, the memory of each winter became more than survival. It became tradition. The tipi was no longer seen merely as protection from the cold, but as a vessel of identity. Every family developed its own way of tying the poles, sewing the hides, or marking the outer walls. These differences, though small, carried deep meaning, connecting them to their ancestors' winters. As children grew, they learned to recognize which tipi belonged to which family by the curve of its frame or the pattern of its seams. During warmer months, elders told the origin stories of the tipi, how it began as a simple shelter of branches and grass and how generations had refined it through patience and understanding of the wind. The shape remained unchanged, yet each generation added its own refinement. Born from the trials of its time, the people came to see their homes as living records, not meant to last forever, but to be rebuilt each year with care and purpose. The craft of tipi making, passed from hands to memory, was as vital as the fire that burned within. It became both shelter and symbol, proof that shared knowledge could outlive even the harshest season. As the seasons continued their endless turn, the building of tipis became more than necessity. It became ritual. Each year, when the wind softened and the grasses turned green again, families gathered to raise their summer camps. The process began just as it always had. Poles selected, hides unrolled, sinew prepared. Yet now, there was ceremony in every motion. Songs were sung as the first tripod rose, voices carrying across the open plains. The people believed that harmony in their work brought harmony to their lives. Women led the sewing and arrangement of hides, their movements smooth and practiced. Men secured the bases and faced each doorway toward the rising sun. Children watched attentively, repeating small gestures with sticks and cords, learning through imitation. When the first fire burned inside a completed tipi, its smoke was greeted not just as necessity, but as blessing. The air filled with the scent of ash and hide, a renewal of community and continuity. Each construction reaffirmed an ancient truth, that the tipi was never built against nature, but alongside it. In building, they honored the balance between land and life, passing down the skill as both craft and prayer. In time, the tipi came to represent the balance of existence itself. Its circular shape reflected unity, the meeting of sky and earth, rest and motion, life inside and beyond. The camp arranged around it followed the same principle. Each shelter formed part of a greater circle, each family a piece of a larger whole. Within that circle, work, learning, and rest all found their rhythm. The people understood that the strength of one tipi meant the strength of all. If one fell to the wind, the others helped rebuild it. From this, cooperation became the heart of their tradition. Travelers from distant bands could read a camp story before entering. The tilt of the poles, the color of the hides, the height of the smoke, all revealed who the people were and how they lived. The tipi itself spoke a language of respect and belonging, one understood across the plains without words. The open land connected them rather than divided them. Every camp carried traces of others, borrowed songs, shared techniques, small painted symbols passed from friend to friend. Over time, these exchanges became a living heritage, written not in books, but in craft and practice. The tipi remained the bridge between family, land, and memory, each one a new chapter in an unending story of survival, community, and renewal. As the years moved on, the making of tipis became both a measure of skill and a sign of maturity. When the young reached the age to build their own shelters, they did so under the careful eyes of parents and elders. Every step mattered: how the poles were chosen, how the knots were tied, how tightly the hides overlapped. A person's first tipi was not simply a dwelling, it was a declaration of readiness, proof that they could create warmth and safety for others. It was celebrated not with feasts, but with quiet approval and trust. The elders offered gentle guidance: turn the doorway eastward, spread the poles wider, choose softer ground. These were not corrections, but extensions of the wisdom passed down through centuries. Over time, the act of building became deeply personal. Some decorated their hides with painted lines honoring hunts or journeys, while others left them plain, believing simplicity reflected humility toward the land. Despite these differences, each tipi held the same essence, a perfect harmony of strength and grace. When the wind rustled across the plains, brushing against the hide walls, the people heard not just the weather but ancestry itself, the voices of generations speaking through their craft. Tradition, they knew, was not preserved through memory alone, but through the act of doing, again and again, with care. By the time spring returned, the people moved easily once again across the open plains. The air carried the scent of thawed soil and wet grass. Rivers broke free from their frozen shells, rushing fast and loud through the valleys. The herds reappeared, dark shapes sweeping like shadows across the horizon. The families followed, their rebuilt tipis packed tightly onto travois drawn by horses and dogs. Children ran ahead, laughing as they chased the fluttering pieces of hide. The land that had tested them all winter now welcomed them with warmth and color. Along the way, they found the bones of old camps, half buried under melting snow. From those places, they gathered what could still serve: stones from fire rings, lengths of rope hardened by frost, fragments of broken tools, and gave them new purpose. To leave nothing wasted was part of their way, a quiet thankfulness to the earth that had carried them through the storms. At night, when they stopped to rest, small fires glowed across the plains like stars fallen to the ground. The same songs that had steadied them through winter now rose into the soft spring air, carried far by the gentle wind. When the people spoke of winter, they did not call it hardship. They called it teacher. Each season brought its own lessons: patience in the storm, wisdom in stillness, endurance in darkness. Those who listened survived. Those who learned thrived. Around the new campfires, elders retold the stories of the last cold season, the fierce winds that nearly tore through the hides, the fire that never died, the laughter that returned when the first thaw began. Every retelling was a reminder that memory was a shield stronger than any wall. Children listened with wide eyes, feeling the same awe their parents once had. Through these stories, knowledge remained alive, not frozen in words, but warmed by voice and presence. The tipi, the fire, the snow, the wind, each element became part of a shared understanding of life's fragile balance. As the years unfolded, those memories shaped every generation. The land changed slowly, but the people's rhythm stayed the same. Winter, spring, summer, and fall each left their mark, weaving together the unbroken thread of their lives. When strangers passed through, traders, wanderers, or distant kin, they paused in wonder at the sight of the tipis standing proud against the horizon. To them, they were simple shelters. To the people who built them, they were proof that harmony with nature could be stronger than any force of will. Each hide, each pole, each knot spoke of survival. The fire inside, humble and small, burned with a light that had never gone out since the first ancestors learned to build it. And so, even when storms came and plains changed, their way endured, flexible, faithful, and alive. In later years, when the elders grew old and their voices trembled, they would sit near the evening fires and tell the young how the first tipis rose from the wisdom of wind and patience. They would say, "The land teaches those who listen. The tipi is the proof that we have listened well." The children, hearing these words, would trace small shapes in the dust, imagining the circles of camps stretching forever across the plains. They would dream of the first snowfalls and the first fires, of the long nights and the sound of wind against hide walls. What the elders gave them was more than story. It was memory preserved through motion. Every pole lifted, every hide stretched, every spark coaxed into flame carried the echo of all that came before. When winter returned again, the people were ready. The winds swept over the plains as they always had, and the first snow fell gently upon the land. But this time, the work came easily. The tipis rose faster, the knots held tighter, and the fires burned steadier. Inside, as the storms howled, the people sat in quiet confidence. The warmth that filled their shelters was not just from the flames, but from the knowledge of all they had endured and remembered. Outside, the world lay white and endless. Inside, it glowed gold and alive. When the night deepened and the last voices faded to silence, the camp rested under a sky thick with stars. The hides rustled softly, the smoke rose steady, and the people slept without fear. They had become part of the rhythm they once struggled against, the circle of land, wind, and fire that would never break. The next morning, as dawn spread across the plains, their smoke curled gently upward, carrying with it the memory of every winter they had survived. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps keep these forgotten voices alive. And please take a moment to watch our other videos. They dive even deeper into Native American history and the untold truths that shaped America.